The dense fog clung to the ground like a restless spirit as 4 men, Ethan, Danny, Carter, and William, set out on their journey into the notorious Blackridge Forest. It was a place few dared to tread. Ancient trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches clawing at the gray sky, casting jagged shadows that danced in the dim light. The forest had an eerie stillness, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for their arrival. For the friends, this wasn't just a hiking trip, it was a memorial for Marcus, the friend they'd lost too soon. They carried his favorite flask of whiskey, promising to toast him at the highest peak. The local guide had warned them before they began, his voice trembling as he spoke of the forest's dark history. "This place, it remembers," he'd said, avoiding their eyes. But they'd laughed it off, eager for adventure and closure. The first day felt like any other hike. They joked and bantered, the crunch of leaves underfoot mingling with their laughter. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the air grew colder, sharper, like icy needles against their skin. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the woods seemed to shift in the dying light. By nightfall, they set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by ancient oaks. The trees loomed so tall and dense that even the moonlight barely penetrated the canopy. The campfire flickered weakly, casting fleeting shapes on the forest floor. As they sat around the fire, their stories of Marcus were interrupted by a distant sound, a low, guttural groan that seemed to echo from nowhere and everywhere at once. "What the hell was that?" Carter whispered, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "Probably just an animal," Danny said, though his eyes darted nervously toward the blackness beyond the firelight. The groan came again, this time closer. It didn't sound like any animal they knew. It was deeper, more primal, filled with something unnatural. A cold wind rushed through the clearing, snuffing out the fire and plunging them into darkness. They spent the night huddled together, too afraid to relight the fire. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made their hearts race. Ethan swore he saw glowing eyes watching from the tree-line, but when he blinked, they were gone. By morning, the forest looked different. The marked trail they'd been following had disappeared, replaced by a maze of unfamiliar paths. The trees seemed closer, their trunks gnarled and warped as if writhing in agony. Moss clung to every surface, damp and slick, and the air reeked of rot. As they trudged forward, a strange object caught Ethan's eye. It was a totem, a crude figure made of sticks and bones, lashed together with sinew. It hung from a tree, swaying gently in the still air. Nearby, symbols had been carved into the bark, spirals and runes that seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly light. Who the hell would make something like this? William muttered, his voice trembling. "No one sane," Danny replied, his bravado cracking under the weight of the growing dread. The deeper they went, the more symbols they found, etched into stones, hanging from branches, and even burned into the ground. The forest felt alive now, watching them, feeding on their fear. As they debated whether to turn back, a scream tore through the silence. It was high-pitched, agonized, and impossibly close. They sprinted toward the sound, their adrenaline overriding their terror, only to stumble upon a horrifying scene. The body of a hiker lay sprawled across the forest floor, his chest ripped open, his entrails glistening in the dim light. His face was frozen in a grotesque mask of fear, his wide eyes staring at nothing. Around him, more symbols had been drawn in blood, forming a grotesque circle. The forest seemed to hum with dark energy, and the wind whispered in an incomprehensible language. A guttural growl echoed from behind them, sending a cold wave of terror down their spines. "Run," Ethan breathed, his voice barely audible. And they did. The forest came alive as they fled. The shadows moved with unnatural speed, branches reached for them like skeletal hands, and the growls grew louder, closer. Whatever hunted them was not human, and it wanted them to know it. Their frantic footsteps pounded against the uneven forest floor as they sprinted through the blackened woods. The air seemed thicker now, clinging to their lungs like smoke. The guttural growls behind them grew louder, echoing through the trees with an unnatural resonance. It sounded close, too close. "Don't stop!" Ethan yelled, though his own legs felt like they were about to give out. Branches lashed at their faces, and the terrain became treacherous. Rocks jutted out of the earth like broken teeth, and roots coiled beneath the undergrowth, tripping them at every turn. William stumbled, letting out a strangled cry as he hit the ground. Ethan turned back, grabbing him by the arm. "Get up! Come on!" Ethan's voice was desperate, his grip firm as he yanked William to his feet. Behind them, something massive moved through the trees. It wasn't just one set of footsteps, it was several, heavy and deliberate, accompanied by the sickening crack of branches being torn apart. A shadow passed through the mist, impossibly tall and wide, its outline distorted, as if the forest itself bent around it. They burst into a clearing, gasping for breath, their clothes soaked in sweat. The clearing was deathly silent, except for their ragged breathing. In the center stood a towering tree, its bark blackened and split as if it had been struck by lightning. Strange symbols were carved into its trunk, deeper and more intricate than anything they'd seen before. Around the base of the tree were objects, small offerings. Animal skulls, trinkets, and what looked like the remains of a decayed human hand. A faint, rhythmic chanting echoed through the air, though it was impossible to tell where it was coming from. "What the hell is this place?" Carter whispered, clutching his sides as he struggled to breathe. It's a shrine," Danny said, his voice hollow. "To whatever's out there." Ethan shook his head, panic rising in his chest. "We need to keep moving." A sudden rustling came from the trees on the other side of the clearing. The friends froze. The sound wasn't the erratic rustle of wind, it was deliberate, rhythmic, as if something enormous was circling them. "Stay together," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. The rustling stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. At first, it looked human, a hunched silhouette draped in tattered robes. But as it stepped into the clearing, the dim light revealed its grotesque form. Its skin was as pale as death, stretched tightly over its skeletal frame. Antlers jutted from its skull-like head, and its eyes were hollow pits, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. Its limbs were too long, bending in ways that defied anatomy, and its breath came in shallow, rattling gasps. "Oh my God," William whispered, his voice cracking. The creature tilted its head, as if studying them. Then it let out a guttural roar that shook the ground, its sound vibrating in their chests. "Run!" Ethan screamed. They bolted into the trees, their fear pushing them forward despite the burning in their legs and lungs. The forest closed in around them, the branches seeming to reach for them, clawing at their faces and clothes. Carter screamed as something grabbed his ankle. He was yanked off his feet, dragged backward into the darkness. The others stopped, turning just in time to see him disappear into the shadows. "Carter!" Ethan shouted, his voice breaking. Carter's screams echoed through the forest, fading into a sickening silence. We can't help him," Danny stammered, his face pale as he grabbed Ethan's arm. "We'll die too if we stay here." Ethan's fists clenched, but he knew Danny was right. They couldn't save Carter, not now. They stumbled forward, blindly pushing deeper into the woods. The shadows seemed alive now, shifting and swirling around them. The guttural growls returned, this time all around them, closing in like a predator playing with its prey. Finally, they came across a small cave tucked into the side of a hill. It was shallow, but it provided just enough cover to catch their breath. They collapsed against the damp walls, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. What was that thing? William whispered, his voice barely audible. I don't know, Danny replied, his eyes fixed on the cave entrance. But it's hunting us. Ethan didn't speak. His hands were shaking, his mind racing with thoughts of Carter's fate. The guilt was suffocating, but so was the realization that they might not make it out alive. Outside, the forest was silent again, but it didn't feel safe. The air was heavy, and the faint smell of decay wafted in, making their stomachs churn. We can't stay here, Ethan finally said, his voice steadier than he felt. If we don't keep moving, it'll find us. Danny nodded reluctantly, though his face was pale. But where do we go? We're lost, and that thing, it's everywhere. The rhythmic chanting returned, faint but unmistakable. It seemed to be coming from deeper within the forest, beckoning them like a siren's call. Wherever that is, William said, his voice hollow, I think it's leading us there. And deep down, they all knew, whatever awaited them at the source of that sound, it was far worse than anything they'd already seen. The moment they stepped out of the cave, an unnatural stillness enveloped them. The air grew dense and suffocating, as if the forest itself was drawing them in, tightening its grip. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, just the heavy, oppressive silence pressing down on them like a suffocating weight. The faint chanting from before was now a constant, pounding rhythm in their ears, each beat syncing with their panicked heartbeats. The sound seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of their bones, like the hum of some terrible, living force. It wasn't just an eerie noise, it was a presence, ancient and malevolent, watching them from the shadows. With each step, the path became more twisted, as though the forest was deliberately warping itself, bending and shifting to trap them. The trees crowded in, their gnarled limbs coiling like the fingers of something dark, something that should never have been alive. The air was frigid, colder than anything they had ever known, and their breaths emerged in sharp, desperate gasps, visible in the air, a fleeting reminder of their fragile humanity. No birds sang. No insects hummed. The forest felt wrong. It felt like it was waiting for something. Do you think we'll make it out of here? William whispered, his voice barely audible, fragile as a dream. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes wide, searching for something to hold on to. Ethan's reply was quick, but hollow. We have to. Though his voice betrayed no fear, doubt curled deep in his gut. It was as if the very forest was swallowing them whole, piece by piece, with no intention of ever letting them go. They walked on, and the passage of time became meaningless. The forest was a labyrinth, a living thing that stretched in every direction, the trees twisting into identical shapes, the path looping back upon itself, trapping them in a maddening cycle. The more they walked, the more they realized they hadn't moved at all. Their legs were sore. Their minds unraveling. And then, they saw it. There, in the heart of the forest, stood a massive stone altar, ancient, covered in moss and grime, a blight in the center of the unnatural woods. The earth around it was dark, stained with something foul and unclean. Rotting branches, twisted and dead, had been woven into a grotesque circle around the altar, and the symbols they had seen earlier now seemed to writhe, shifting and morphing as if they had a life of their own. The chanting had grown to a deafening crescendo, a choir of voices that seemed to bleed together, pulling at their minds, pulling at their very souls. Danny's voice cracked, barely a whisper. Is that a person? In the shadow of the altar stood a figure, hunched, draped in tattered black rags, the fabric fluttering in a wind that wasn't there. Its face was hidden beneath a dark hood, but there was a faint, unnatural glow beneath it, flickering like dying embers in a hollow, endless pit. Slowly, the figure lifted its head, and what stared back at them were hollow eyes, dark as death, absorbing the light, drawing them in, pulling them closer. It was the creature. The one with the antlers. The one that had hunted them. And now, it was calling them. Ethan's heart thundered in his chest as the creature raised one long, twisted hand toward them. The fingers were long and gnarled, like ancient roots clawing at the earth. The air around them thickened, heavy with a presence they could not escape. The chanting grew louder, faster, like the forest itself urging them forward. "Don't go closer," William choked out, his voice strained, his body trembling. But it was useless. The pull of the forest, the invisible force pulling at their very souls, was too strong. Ethan's felt his legs move, dragging him unwillingly toward the altar. His feet scraped against the cold, dark earth, each step a battle between his body and something far older, more powerful. "Stop!" Danny screamed, grabbing Ethan's arm, but his grip was weak, slipping, as though the very air around them had turned to oil. His hand failed to grasp anything solid, and Danny stumbled back, panic flooding his face. The creature's hollow gaze burned into Ethan's. With every step toward it, the ground beneath him seemed to tremble. The earth was alive, reacting to the presence of the altar, to the creature. The chanting reached a fever pitch, voices whispering terrible secrets, unspeakable horrors, promises of power and agony. A wind howled, though the trees remained motionless, the world around them screaming. The altar cracked open with a sickening sound. The earth split, revealing a black abyss beneath it, a void that swallowed all light. It was not just dark. It was emptiness, the absence of anything. "No!" William screamed, reaching for Ethan, but his fingers slipped through Ethan's like smoke, as if the world itself was collapsing. Then, with a deafening crack, the ground shattered beneath them. The air thickened, pressing in on them from every side. Ethan felt himself falling, plummeting into the abyss. He could hear William's screams, fading away into the distance as he fell, but he couldn't bring himself to look back. He was already lost, and he knew it. Then, everything stopped. The chanting. The wind. The world. Ethan opened his eyes, and the first thing he saw was the bright, unforgiving light of day. The sun hung high in the sky, birds chirped, and the forest appeared normal. Safe. His breath caught in his chest. He stood up slowly, but a chill crept down his spine. Something wasn't right. The ground felt soft beneath his feet, too soft. It was like wet clay, and the air had the distinct smell of decay, something long dead, something that should never have rotted. As he turned around, his heart stopped. William. Danny. Carter. All of them, standing motionless in a circle. Their faces twisted in agony, frozen in terror. Their eyes, empty. Hollow. Like the creature's eyes. The ground around them was covered in the same symbols, the ones etched into the altar. The chanting began again, louder now, filling the air with its maddening rhythm. The trees around them shifted, their branches twisting and swaying like skeletal fingers, as if the very forest itself was alive, hungry. Ethan staggered back, his chest tightening. His breaths became shallow, the panic clawing at his throat. He tried to move, but his feet felt like they were sinking into the earth, glued in place by the weight of the terror pressing in on him. The truth hit him like a physical blow. They were all dead. All of them. trapped. And then, in the silence, the creature's voice echoed in his mind, a hollow, ancient whisper that filled him with a cold, gnawing dread. You are the forest now. You will never leave. As the shadows closed in, suffocating and unrelenting, Ethan screamed. His cry was swallowed by the darkness, by the forest, by something that would never let him go.